War of the Worlds, The Resurrection, a novel by J. M. Dillard. Chapter 3. By the time dawn came, Massoud and the others had gone to plant charges around the base's perimeter while Urich and Chambers unloaded the truck. It had been more than 24 hours since Urich had any rest, but she was not in the least bit sleepy. Physically, a bit tired and bleary-eyed, perhaps. Emotionally, she began with absolute exhilaration. They were doing it. They were actually doing it. Soon the world would hear of them. She would have a place in history. It was all too soon replaced by absolute dread. She'd gone too far to expect mercy, to expect to live if something went wrong with their plans. At weak moments, she found herself doubting. Chambers' plan had seemed so simple. Overrun the base and transmit the message. They would booby-trap the perimeter to slow the army down, and the nuclear waste would provide them with more protection than any hostage could. Load some waste onto the truck, along with the explosives, and no one would try to stop them from making good their escape. The important thing, Chambers kept repeating, was to get the message to the world, to call upon fellow anarchists to bring about worldwide chaos. It had seemed important enough to die for, or at least Urich had thought so then. Now, despair overcame her. If the government found a way onto the base, she, Chambers, all of them were dead as the 2 men she had killed. As dead as the 17 blood-caked bodies piled into one far corner of the yard, growing stiff under the sun's first rays. Only we just don't know it yet. Through it all, she worked with detached efficiency. She brought the transmitter dish from the back of the truck and knelt down in the sandy soil to adjust it. Didn't need sleep. She'd just as soon never sleep again, but she could definitely use a shower. Tiny red droplets spattered the front of her white jumpsuit. There were dirty smudges on the knees and pockets. "Could you help me with this?" Chambers appeared in the back of the truck with a video cam in his arms. The tripod stuck awkwardly in the crook of one elbow, and in danger of slipping out. She walked up the ramp and slid it carefully from his arms. "Thanks," he said. He'd been quiet too, but now he gave her a long look, the way he did when he wanted to initiate conversation. He walked down the ramp in front of her with short, careful steps, and waited while she set the tripod up. It took some time to get it to stand straight in the sand. "So how are you doing, Lena?" He carefully nestled the camera atop the tripod. She was on her way back to work on the dish and jerked her head to look back at him. He'd never called her Lena before. At first, she almost yelled at him, "Don't call me that. Lena is dead. Lena doesn't exist anymore. Only Urich, soldier of the People's Liberation Army." But his expression was concerned. Concerned about me? She wondered. No matter. We're all going to die soon. "All right," she answered shortly, and went over to squat by the transmitter. Chambers was silent. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. He was studying her intently. Finally, he said, "I want you to know how much I admire the way you've handled yourself through all this." If he'd said all this sooner, maybe it would have mattered. She shrugged. "I did what I had to do." "This is more than most people do," he paused. "Especially when it comes to killing. I know it isn't easy." "Do you?" She gave him a hard look. "No," Chambers said quickly, bitterly. "No, I don't really know. I've never killed anyone face to face, the way you did today. Doing it long distance was hard enough." Ashamed, he looked away. She sat on her haunches, staring at him. She felt a surge of accomplishment, of pride. He admires me. He's envious of my strength. At the same time, it was unsettling, frightening. Chambers may have been a political science professor, but he knew no more about revolution than she did, was no more qualified than she to lead one. He'd made her kill the guards because he was afraid to do it himself. She turned back to her work, disgusted. He started back for the truck, then stopped. I can get the rest of the equipment. You set up. After all, you're the mass communications major. She nodded. He finished unloading, then came to stand beside her as she was getting the camera where she wanted it. The schedule calls for us to transmit in 47 minutes, Chambers said. He scuffed the toe of one boot nervously in the sand. We'll be ready. She was peering into the camera, then looked up at him. Why don't you stand about 3 feet in front of me? Here, she pointed. He stood in the wrong place. No, she said, gesturing. More to the left. I want... But Chambers didn't move. Exasperated, she came around the camera and took him by the shoulders to show him. He grasped her hand and looked at her meaningfully. 47 minutes. It would be a while before the others returned from setting charges around the base's perimeter. Her expression hardened. She pushed him where she wanted him, pulled her hand away, and stepped behind the camera again. Better. I can keep you in frame and still see the barrels in the background. She wanted the barrels in the shot to prove they were actually on the Jericho Valley site. Some of the barrels had been knocked over, no doubt during the struggle. At first, she wanted to ask Chambers to set them upright, then decided it would be more effective to leave them and show that a battle had taken place. Chambers was not offended by the rebuttal. Maybe he took hope from the fact she hadn't been angered by it. He smiled at her. You're cheerful, she said without enthusiasm. Suddenly, he was hyper, talkative. Perhaps Yurik decided the realization hit him that he was really going to be on worldwide television. Something about the irony of pirating a U.S. communications satellite to broadcast our demands always makes me smile, he answered. She was not amused. Smile on camera and no one will take us seriously. The way he was grinning made her uncomfortable. If they don't, Chambers was suddenly serious, we'll just have to blow this place up and send a big fat nuclear cloud of radioactive waste floating over their nice middle-class homes. He smiled again. She couldn't return it. For the first time, she saw everything clearly. He was a madman, this Chambers, a charismatic madman with a talent for making his insanity sound logical, even attractive to misfits such as she. The premonition of death came over her again, this time stronger than ever, and so bitterly cold that she shivered in the early morning chill. Chambers was too wrapped up in his dream of global fame to notice. He, Yurik, Finney, Mossood, Teal, Einhorn, they were all as dead as the bodies stacked in the yard, even if they were still walking around. Consciousness seeped back. A long darkness, then awareness, then sweltering, agonizing suffocation. He was trapped in some type of metal confine, and there was not enough air. He gasped, probing frantically until he found the roof of the confine. The metal was corroded there. He encountered a hole and pushed with all his newfound energy. The metal crumpled under the pressure. He was free. Panting, dazed, he pulled himself out. But the light was painfully harsh. He hid for a moment in a patch of shade created by the containers, and tried to understand where he was. This was not home. The air was too rich, the gravity too heavy, the light too strong. Memories of the battle returned. They had been successful at first, claiming victory when the sickness had overcome them. Defeat so close to success had been bitter. Best for them to die here on this alien rock than to return home vanquished. He had been trying to maneuver his ship back to the base when the fever came upon him. Around him, vessels fell from the sky as their pilots died at the controls. His transmitter reported the sad message that 2 of the 3 members of the Supreme Leader had perished. Shortly after, he succumbed himself to the pain and blacked out. A miracle he had not been killed when his vessel crashed. Another miracle, the sickness was gone. As confusion lifted, he remembered his duty to find the others, especially the surviving member of the Supreme Leader and the Advocate, and to see to it that all their efforts had been in vain. No doubt the others were trapped in the same type of horrible container he had emerged from. Zashran set to work. Masood planted the last of the booby traps and covered it gently with sand. He'd gotten only a couple of hours' sleep the day before, pre-battle nerves, and had been working through the night. He stood up, dusting the sand from the legs of his jumpsuit, then stretched, and gently rotated the arm connected to the sore shoulder. Probably had himself one hell of a bruise, but then it could have been worse. He could be lying dead in the yard instead of that lieutenant. Masood raised the sleeve of his jacket to peer at his most recent acquisition. It really was a nice watch, a Rolex, probably worth a nice fat wad of greenbacks. And then Masood chuckled to himself. If Chambers' little TV show was successful, he wouldn't have to worry about how much he could pawn the watch for. Hell, he wouldn't have to worry about dollars ever again. Not much longer to airtime. He started humming an old tune. Act Naturally. Who'd recorded it? The Beatles? Must have been all of 6 when he'd first heard it. He started back toward the truck. He hadn't made it very far when he passed by an aisle of barrels. But something about them wasn't right. He stopped to take a closer look. Finney appeared, stepping gingerly so as not to set off any of the charges. "Masood, it's almost time." "Right behind you." Masood gestured for him to go on. Finney nodded. His careful steps crunched noisily against the gravel as he left. Masood drew closer to the curious scene. This was the spot where just last night Finney had killed the lieutenant. Masood knew that none of the barrels had been knocked over then, and no one had been there since he and Finney dragged the body away. Yet now 6 barrels from the lower tier, the older, rusted ones, were overturned. Didn't make any sense at all. Masood bent over to examine one. What the hell? The top of the barrel looked as if it had been exploded from the inside, as if whatever had been in there had forced its way out, and then left. The barrel was completely empty. Question was, where the hell had it gone? He saw with alarm that the blood-smeared barrel on the upper tier was leaking where Finney's bullet holes had punctured it. It must have dripped onto the barrel and eaten the top away. Masood cringed. Probably radioactive or toxic or something, and he'd been exposed to it. He turned to run, to warn the others. Something stirred behind one of the upright barrels, scraped softly across the gravel. Masood raised his gun. "Come out! Come out with your hands up or I'll start shooting!" Someone, something, rose and moved into view. Masood stared. For an instant his mind simply refused to accept what his eyes told him. It was an animal, he thought at first, some strange, hideous beast, but it was like nothing Masood had ever seen. He'd grown up by the ocean, and to him the thing resembled a huge jellyfish, about 5 feet tall, not quite as wide, walking wobbly on its tentacles. Only its skin looked like gray-brown leather, oiled and glistening. Its lipless, open mouth quivered and drooled. The worst was its eye, a huge, dark thing that gazed intently at Masood with far more intelligence than any animal. "Dear God," Masood whispered. He took a step backward. Soft, 3-fingered appendages rustled behind him, wreathed themselves around his neck. He went down, shooting. Urich adjusted the sound equipment behind the camera. While Chambers smoothed his hair down in a handheld mirror for the 5th time, Einhorn and Teal cracked off-color jokes and watched from the fringes. Chambers was becoming nervous and increasingly obsessed with his appearance. Even asked Urich's opinion about whether he should wear his glasses on the air. She told him it didn't matter. It was in the little things, her father had said, and not the big ones, that people revealed their true character. She'd never believed it before, but now, watching Chambers, she wondered. He looked up anxiously from the mirror. "Could you help me with my collar?" "It looks fine," she answered shortly. Then, to give him something to do and hopefully shut him up, "Sound check." "Testing," Chambers said in a deeper than normal voice. 1, 2, 3. Finney walked up and stood next to Teal and Einhorn, who were laughing and nudging each other. They were excited and happy. Urich realized, why wasn't she? Chambers read dramatically from the smudged paper in his slightly trembling hand. "We, the free soldiers of the People's Liberation Party, have come to you, citizens of the world, with a list of demands including the immediate resignation of the President of the United States." She glanced at her watch and silenced him. "Perfect. 5 minutes." Chambers nodded, looking a bit green at the thought. 5 minutes, and the world would be forever changed. Strangely, the closer the time for the broadcast came, the less she believed it would actually happen. It was like killing those corporals. It simply wasn't real. There was only one thing she believed in anymore, and that was the cold sensation of death's nearness that draped her like a shroud. Yet, at the same time, she told herself there was no reason to be afraid now. When success was in their hands, but Urich was unable to shake the fear. "Where's Massoud?" Teal asked. "On his way," Finney answered. Chambers snapped at Finney. "You heard her, only 5 minutes. Just what's taking him so long?" Finney shrugged and began to answer, but his words were drowned out by gunfire. "Massoud?" Chambers shouted. Instinctively, Urich ran to the truck and found the Uzi propped against it. She expected to hear more bursts, but after the first, all was silent. Even so, the 5 of them spread out and headed for the gunfire's source. Urich made her way down an aisle of barrels, working her way parallel to Teal and Einhorn. "This is it," she told herself. "They found us, and now we're all going to die." She was sick with fear, but not at all surprised, as if she had known from the start this was going to happen. A man screamed to her left. She whirled, Uzi at the ready, and craned her neck to see over the barrels. 2 aisles down, the briefest glimpse, Finney down, back arching, mouth a rictus, being dragged by his legs by something dark. It looked like there were ropes around his thighs, but she wasn't sure even in the bright daylight. He disappeared behind a towering stack of barrels, gave one final blood-chilling scream, then fell silent. "Finney," she mouthed silently. No gunfire. Whatever had taken Finney did not use bullets. She began to follow after him, but cautiously. On the other side of the yard, one of the barrels fell, or was knocked over. "Chambers!" she called hoarsely, shifting the Uzi and wiping first one wet palm, and then the other, on the front of her jumpsuit. No answer. Louder. "Chambers?" A rustle, this time on her right. Muted sounds of someone struggling, a muffled cry. "Teal!" she shouted. "Einhorn! Chambers!" She was clenching her teeth now, the gun held tightly in both hands. Dear God, she was alone. Only a few yards in front of her came the sound of a barrel scraping across the ground, being moved aside. A shadow fell across the ground at her feet. She froze and raised the gun. Massoud stepped in front of her. "Massoud," she said, embarrassed that she had been so terrified, that she had thought herself alone among the dead. "What the hell is going on?" There was something not right about the way he stood. The odd, unnatural angle of his head and neck. His arms dangled, useless-looking, from his body. Masood, are you okay?" Masood didn't answer, just looked at her with eyes she did not recognize. She screamed at him, at once furious and terrified that he would not reassure her. "Answer me, Masood!" Masood opened his mouth and answered with a strange, unearthly moan. Horrible, meaningless sounds. She sobbed and backed away from him into something yielding and slickly wet. Before she could turn to look at it, something whip-like and incredibly strong fastened itself around her arms, her neck, and exerted crushing force on her windpipe. Fear gave way to simple astonishment.